This is the Fender Rhodes piano. I bought this, I remember in 1994. This was like the first instrument I bought in the United States. This keyboard I bought in 1998. I still play it, I love it. This is the clavinet. Like if you see Stevie Wonder, he plays this a lot, you know?
This is for the funk sound.
Yeah, very much so, yeah. So I love this. I use it a lot. And then this was my piano.
After you come back to the music scene again with your new identity, do you feel a little bit challenged to re-establish yourself and tell everyone who you are?
Yeah. It was a little bit like starting over, because I did so much Turkish music that actually a lot of people started to know me as, you know, traditional Turkish music performer. I didn't care about that. It was much more about learning the music for me. But eventually, when I decided to, you know, relaunch with a new album and everything, it was, some people were like, Mehmet, wait, oh yeah, I remember you, like, because the jazz world, they don't pay attention to traditional music, like world music world, you know, so they're like two separate worlds, or classical world too. So it's three separate worlds. They don't really pay attention to each other unless you're very famous. Like, unless you're a very, very famous traditional music performer, then they may have heard about you. So that was not the case. So it was more like people trying to remember, you know. And I was lucky, Tani. I was lucky that a Far Cry commissioned me. You know, that was completely by luck. And then one advantage also that I think I should give credit to myself. Remember how you asked me about, like, if there were dark moments in my career because jazz was hard to make a living? And there was. But because I cultivated a following, especially Turkish Americans, they were like really appreciating, you know, what I did, or what I was doing with Turkish music in you know, the United States especially. You know, after like 10 years or so, when I said to them, to these people who were, you know, supporting me, I said, you know, I have a jazz identity. I haven't been connected to that identity much, but I said, I want to relaunch my career as a jazz musician. Would you support me? Almost all of them said yes. So in a strange way, when I was trying to survive in the jazz world, just as a jazz musician, it was difficult. But then when all of these people who've learned about me through traditional music, they were happy supporting me in jazz too. So that's how I released my first album. With their support, fundraising.
In one of your performances, the album called What's Next, you incorporate a lot of the mysticisms. And, you know, a lot of the musicians are now doing all those storylines and also incorporate spiritual elements into the music. Do you have any suggestions in designing those works?
To me, one of the principal things is, in fact, to really learn about these traditions, to internalize them. That's the word that I like the most. Just to be fair, you know, if you go to a classical music conservatory, you know, like, you study piano for so long, right? I mean, to internalize the language of Beethoven, Brahms, Mozart, right? If you spend so much time for whatever tradition that you learned, and if you really want to create a profound work, why not spend that kind of time, you know, for this other tradition? Of course, I'm open to being influenced by anything. But if you really want to internalize something, some cultural aspect, I think it takes a long time. And especially when it comes to spirituality, I think that's important, because spirituality can become commercialized easily. Just to
Yeah.
give an example, like Buddhism, like
Yeah.
now everything, there's all kinds of commodities,
Yeah. Or just yoga. for
or just
example.
yoga, yeah. So it can become cheapened. It's so funny. How can it become cheap? It's supposed to be something
Yeah.
so internal, so personal, right? So, such a contradiction. Well, part of the reason that it can be cheapened is because, you know, because people don't really invest a lot of time in them. They kind of remain surface level. I think when we speak of mysticism, I think this is one of the biggest problems and dangers. So, in my opinion, for me anyway, it took a long time. Like a lot of the books here are about Sufism, Islamic mysticism. During those 10 years of studying Turkish music, I really also delved deep into the world of Sufism. It's a very sophisticated philosophy, and there are many different brotherhoods, and so it took a long time for me to study and learn about it. I mean, these are supposed to be mystical sciences. They're not supposed to be easily attainable. They require studentship.
I think it's the mindset and then the mentality. As you said, it's not about religion, but the religious mindset.
It does not
Of
have to be
studying
about
everything.
religion.
Yeah.
It does not have to be. But it has to be about a personal quest. And a personal quest, it's got to be something personal, a quest, something that you launch and you get on that path. And the path for many years is going to be difficult.
In one of your songs, which is called Palindrome, and you use a very special instrument called zurna. How do you incorporate this special instruments into the instrumental levels?
Okay, that's a good question because when I first started reconnecting with Turkish music, it was actually mostly through zurna. Strangely enough, because the zurna, loud double reed, very loud and kind of very strange. My parents didn't understand why I picked this instrument, and at the time I didn't understand it much too. I knew that it was a personal quest, but if you asked me why am I doing all of this, I probably couldn't answer at the time. Now I think I understand it much better. But also in time I found out the jazz orchestra, the big band, its roots go back to military, like marching bands.
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah. And marching bands, their roots go back to Turkey.
Turkey.
Yeah. I've been thinking about these things. I've been thinking what would be an organic way to bring some of the Turkish instruments into the jazz orchestra, etc. Like not necessarily to have them be soloists, but really be part of the orchestra. Suddenly I thought, wait a second, jazz orchestra, marching band, Janissary band, mehter. And I was like, well, so if you think about the winds, in the jazz orchestra, it's brass and reeds. Marching band, brass, reeds. Same thing in the Janissary band, brass, reeds. So what's the reed instrument? Zurna. So I thought, well, the answer is that clear. If I take the zurna and put it in the big band, it should work. Of course, it was risky. I mean, until you do these things, you don't know if they're going to work. It's because again, it's a loud instrument. So well, I mean, it could be, it could be very disastrous. If it doesn't work, it'd be like, everyone will be, oh, Mehmet, what are you doing? But it worked. It was the perfect match. It was like, to this day, when I play that instrument in the big band, just like the saxophones, they don't need microphones, right?
No.
The zurna doesn't need a microphone. It cuts through the whole thing. It's so powerful.
Yeah.
That's its natural habitat.
Yeah.
That's what it was born. That's how that lineage worked. So this is a longer size ney. It's closer to like an alto flute.
about the Turkish roots? Mozart even wrote Turkish.
Of course, yeah. The Alaturka Rondo, or all the Alaturka movement was very much inspired by this band, the Mehter band. Yeah.
And I heard there's a drum set. Actually, the symbol is coming from Turkish.
The Zildjian symbols, world famous Zildjian symbols, they come from Turkey. In fact, this is not even a secret. On their website, they have their history. And if you look at it, it says, like 1623, I believe, is when they were established in Turkey. And they were building symbols for those Mehter bands. That's where they come from. So technically, the roots of the jazz band, the drum set, they all go back to Turkey. Yeah.
Wow, incredible.
Yeah.
You have collaborated with all of the legends in the US mostly, and one of notable saxophonists, Dave Liebman, and the name is called Rise Up. During the collaboration, what are some of the surprising things you have learned from him?
Well, first of all, that project, the Rise Up, remains a highlight in my career because, I mean, he is a living legend, and he worked with big, jazz giants like Elvin Jones, Miles Davis. Yeah. So, to work with Dave Liebman was basically a connection for me to those legends. This is how music works, right? It's like chain. Through him, I connected,
the souls.
I got connected into that jazz history. Yeah. So I'll remain forever grateful to Dave Liebman for giving me a chance. I invited him for an album I did in 2016 to play on it. And he was gracious enough. He came, he played. And then I asked him if he would play concerts. He said yes. And then when we did the concerts, he heard other pieces where I played the zurna, for example. And then I think that's when he got inspired and he saw that I was doing something that was unique. He said, I want you to write a big piece for me. Okay, I thought maybe he's talking 15 minutes. So I said, so what do you think about duration? He said, album long. Well, I said, you mean an hour? Yeah, 45 minutes, an hour. I was like, whoa. But coming from a living legend of jazz, I took it very seriously. And so I took my time too. I did several grant applications and I tried to come up with concepts and themes that would work, because Dave Liebman wanted me to bring in the Turkish color. Also, he's Jewish, and so he wanted to have something to connect with that history as well. So I was like, how do I bring all three of these elements together? It's not easy. And he also wanted it to be programmatic. So how do you come up with something that can be coherent? So it was the Rise Up, because that piece has three large sections, three big movements with three smaller sections within those movements. And each of these three movements are about historical characters. Then they rose up after the trauma, and they gave us important things. They could have been, in other words, lost, to history after experiencing trauma. But instead, they rose up. And so I thought about Rumi, the great mystical poet, who experienced the trauma, but then he gave us his great poetry and his great mysticism. And then the Sephardic Jewish people who experienced a great trauma during the Spanish Inquisition, but then they came to the Middle East and they gave us great culture, great music. And then the third one is Sinan, the architect, who also experienced the trauma, but he grew to be one of the greatest architects ever. So that was the theme, but it didn't, it took me a long time to come up with this theme,
I'm very interested in one of those little things. For example, we call it modes, right? But you call it makams.
Makam, yeah.
So for those things that maybe when you interact with musicians in this particular albums, do you have to educate them somehow?
So, okay, so there are some realities, and as a composer, I know what's possible and what's not. I can't bring someone like Dave Liebman and expect that he's going to have the time to sit down with me and learn about intonation of a particular makam or even how they work traditionally. It's just he's busy, he doesn't have the time. So that's reality. Or even with a Far Cry, 18-piece orchestra. What am I going to do? You know, no, you need to put your finger here. It's impossible, right? You're lucky if you have 3 rehearsals. Basically, as a composer, then I developed ways, you know, to counter these things. First of all, a makam is a feeling. So they're not going to know that feeling. I know it. If I internalize the makam, I think it's possible to communicate that feeling other ways. It doesn't always have to have the microtones. But again, it comes back to the same thing. You have to internalize it so that you really understand the mood.
So you got the essence of
yes,
it. Yeah.
the essential component. So you can approach it another way to try to evoke the same kind of feeling. I think you know, part of what I have, you know, done many times in my compositions is that. And then there are other things I've done, like because I play the trumpet a little bit, so I found ways to get some of the microtones just not by ear, but by mechanical adjustments. Like you extend some of the tubes and use different fingerings. Same thing on the saxophones. I worked on it with friends. I don't play the saxophone. I worked on it with friends for some time, and then we experimented and we came up with several fingerings, alternate fingerings, which produce certain microtones. And so some of my compositions include these things. And then in some of them, in the Rise Up too, I play the zurna, you know, but Dave Liebman too plays. Like, so, you know, these are my ways of balancing these things.
Wow. I found you always have those very unique perspectives, no matter in educating or communicating, and also finding rhythm cycles. So one of your pieces called Times of the Turtle Dove, and you incorporate the turtle dove sounds into the rhythm.
Right.
And that's very interesting because we know turtle dove was a symbolist for trust, for love. Shakespeare put a lot of words for that. So you put it into 5/8.
Yeah, I mean, it was the discovery. The musical discovery about that inspired this entire composition, because in classical Turkish music, there is a cycle that's called fahte, which means turtle dove, but it's in 20 beats. It's very long.
Very long then.
But then in 18th century, that same rhythmic cycle existed in 10 beats. You know, I kind of saw the relationship between the two. I didn't know about the 5-beat cycle. I discovered that by the help of another friend who was doing musicological research. And he pointed out a 15th century manuscript. And he said, in this manuscript, it says that the call of the turtle dove is you know, this usul cycle, the rhythmic cycle. But he didn't connect it to the 10 and 20 beats. He just saw and told me. And then I was like, the call of the turtle dove in the Middle East and in the Near East is very specific. It's cuckoo, coo, cuckoo, coo. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what the manuscript said. It said the call of the turtle dove is fateh. So like ta 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 ta. And I was like, how is that possible? And then I looked at the 10. And I saw that it was like a slowed down version of the same thing. Like, in other words, if I expanded the 5-beat, they lined up. And then I saw that the 10-beat, if I expanded that, it lined up with the current 20-beat. And I was like, oh, wow, in like 5 centuries, the call of the turtle dove slowed down into 10, into 20. So it was so inspiring.
Also, you are a great instrument inventor. One of your songs talk about Turkish blues, and you invented the oud from a traditional to an electric version.
I had this idea for a long time. And it was because when I first started playing Turkish music, a couple of friends said, well, let's try with, you know, like jazz setting, like drum set, bass, you know, oud. And so I would use the acoustic instrument, and the acoustic instrument, you know, with a microphone or little pickup microphone that you put on the body of it. If you're playing with like a drum set, something fast, when you turn up the volume of those kinds of microphones, or those kinds of little pickups, acoustic pickups, they will give you feedback after a certain point because they're acoustic instruments. And so I was like, why don't we do the same thing, like that happened with electric guitar, put magnetic pickups. I was thinking about that for many years, but then turns out this friend of mine was also doing experimenting. And so I said, hey, look, this is the idea I have in my mind. Could you build it? He had not built one with the exact specifics that I had in mind. He said, but yes, he could. And so he did. And yeah, so I started playing it as of last year.
And also, let's talk about Renaissance 17,
Okay.
which is another great
Right.
and fascinating instrument.
That really is an invention, yes. I had the idea for that 25 years ago when I was at NEC as a master's student. And at the time, one of my professors took us to the organ room, one of the organ rooms there. And they had, at the time, an organ, which is no longer there. But at the time, it was one of the bigger organs. And it had these additional keys in the bottom, at least. And the organ was tuned to early music, like a mean tone temperament, an early music temperament. So it was not like equal temperament.
Yeah.
And when my teacher played it, the impact was so huge on me. I was like, wow. It sounded more like Turkish music to my ears. The tuning is so different. And so it was 25 years ago, I had this idea pop up in my head. I said to myself, why not build a keyboard that would have all additional keys in an octave with the flats and sharps, but also make it digital. So if it's digital, that way, I can actually play any sound. I can play organ, I can play electric piano, whatever. And also you can change the tuning. You don't have to keep like an acoustic instrument, you don't need to tune it all the time. It's just you push a button and there you have it. I introduced this wooden prototype in a concert, and then because it's very heavy, it's not portable, so I couldn't take it to places. If I'm playing a concert in New York, I can't take it. I would be very scared to put this on the plane, for example. So I said to myself, we should do a lighter plastic version, and I thought about 3D printing, and so I started working with someone from Harvard, and we just finished the first 3D printed version of it. Right. So yeah, there it is. Try this one.